You think you know who the villain is. You walk into a room and see a woman holding a needle over a child, and your brain screams monster. But what if your eyes are lying? What if the real monster is the one sleeping in your bed, and the woman you are about to destroy is the only reason your children are still breathing? This is how $1 billion life falls apart in a single second. The blizzard outside was a white curtain erasing Chicago from the map. Inside the armored SUV, Julian Thorne gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned the color of bone. The flight to Zurich had been grounded. The multi-million-dollar merger was on hold. All the billionaire biotech CEO wanted was the warmth of his home and the sound of his triplets laughing. He was not supposed to be there. No one knew he was coming. The iron gates of the Thorne estate groaned against the wind as they parted. The house stood like a dark fortress against the snow. Massive, imposing, silent, too silent. Julian stepped into the foyer, shaking the ice from his coat. The air inside hit him like a physical blow. It was freezing. He frowned, tapping the smart home panel on the wall. The readout made his heart skip a beat. Third floor climate control disabled. Manual override active. The third floor, the nursery. Panic cold and sharp spiked in his chest. He did not call out. He did not take the elevator. He took the marble stairs two at a time, his footsteps muffled by the storm raging outside. Why was the heat off? Where was the night nanny? Where was Victoria? The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was heavy. It felt like a graveyard. He reached the landing. The door to the children's suite was cracked open just an inch. A sliver of darkness. Then he heard it. Not a cry. Not a laugh. A gagging sound. A wet, choked noise like someone fighting for air. Julian pushed the door open. The scene before him defied every logic his scientific mind possessed. It looked like a ritual. It looked like a slaughter. Ebony Davis, the quiet African-American maid he had hired 6 months ago, was on the floor. She was not cleaning. She was straddling his 4-year-old son Noah. Her knees pinned the boy's small arms to the hardwood. Noah was thrashing his face, turning a shade of violet Julian had never seen. In Ebony's hand, raised high above her head, was a syringe. Not a medical device. A jagged makeshift thing that looked like it had been salvaged from a trash can. But that was not all. In the corner, Lucas and Ava were bound. They were tied to their heavy wooden chairs with strips of ripped bedsheets. Their eyes were wide, bulging with terror, and thick gray duct tape was plastered over their mouths. The world tilted on its axis. The billionaire did not see a woman trying to save a life. He saw an execution. Ebony brought the needle down. "Get away from him!" The roar tore from Julian's throat, a primal sound that shattered the freezing air. He did not think. He did not hesitate. He launched himself across the room, a missile of pure fatherly rage slamming into Ebony's ribs just as the needle pierced the skin. The sound of a body hitting plaster echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. Julian did not hold back. The force of his shove sent Ebony flying backward, and she collided with the wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The makeshift syringe spun from her hand, sailing through the air in slow motion before shattering against the hardwood floor. The cloudy liquid hissed as it splashed across the polished oak, soaking into the expensive rug uselessly. Ebony slid to the floor, gasping, clutching her side. Her ribs burned with a fire that told her something was cracked. But she did not look at her injury. Her eyes, wide and desperate, were locked on the boy. Noah was not breathing right. The 4-year-old body arched off the floor in a violent convulsion. His eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites. A gurgling sound rose from his throat, and then he vomited. A thick green bile erupted from his small mouth, staining his pajamas and pooling on the floor. To Julian it looked like the final stage of a poisoning. He dropped to his knees beside his son, his hands hovering, shaking, terrified to touch the boy. Terrified he would break him. "You killed him." The words tore from his throat, raw and broken. He looked back at Ebony with eyes that held no humanity. Only a father's grief turned into a predator's rage. "You poisoned my son!" Ebony tried to speak, to scream, that the liquid on the floor was the cure, not the poison, but her lungs refused to fill. She could only wheeze, pointing a trembling finger at the boy. "No," she gasped. "It is the food!" Before she could finish, a shrill scream cut through the tension. Victoria St. James burst into the room. She was a vision of chaotic glamour, wrapped in a sheer silk robe that cost more than Ebony made in a year. Her hair was perfectly tousled, her face arranged in a mask of horrified shock. "Oh my God, Julian!" Victoria shrieked, rushing past Ebony, as if the maid were a pile of trash. She threw herself onto the floor beside the convulsing child. I told you she was unstable. Look at him! Julian, look at what she did to our baby! Victoria's voice was high-piercing, designed to drown out reason. She did not look at the syringe. She did not look at the terrified faces of Lucas and Ava, still bound to their chairs and watching their brother die with wide, silent eyes. She only looked at Julian, ensuring his eyes were on her. "She hates them." Victoria sobbed, loud, theatrical tears streaming down her face. "She hates them because they cry too much. She told me yesterday she wanted them to be quiet forever. I didn't think she meant this." It was a lie. A perfect, poisonous lie. But in the chaos of the freezing room, with vomit on the floor and a convulsing child, it sounded like the only truth that made sense. Victoria leaned over Noah. Her long manicured fingers grabbed the boy's face. She pulled him close, cradling his head against her silk chest. To Julian, it looked like a mother's desperate comfort. But Ebony, watching from the floor with vision blurring from pain, saw the truth. Victoria was not checking his airway. She was not checking his pulse. Her thumb was aggressively wiping the corner of Noah's mouth. She was scrubbing away a thick, oily smear of brown paste. Peanut butter. Ebony's heart hammered against her bruised ribs. Victoria knew. She knew Noah was deathly allergic to peanuts, and she was wiping away the evidence before the paramedics arrived. She was cleaning the murder weapon right in front of the father's eyes. "Stop!" Ebony rasped, trying to push herself up. Her legs failed her. "It is the butter. She is wiping it off." But her voice was too weak. Victoria looked up, her eyes locking with Ebony's over Julian's shoulder. For a second, the mask dropped. There was no fear in Victoria's eyes. There was only a cold, triumphant smirk. She had won, and she knew it. "Get her out of here!" Victoria screamed, turning back to Julian, pressing Noah's face into her shoulder to hide the last of the allergen. "She is going to hurt him again, Julian, do something." Julian stood up. His face was stone. His eyes were void of anything but cold fury. He turned toward Ebony, and for the first time in her life, she saw what a billionaire looked like when he decided to destroy someone. "No, it is anaphylactic shock." Ebony gasped for air, her voice raspy and desperate as she tried to crawl toward the convulsing child. "That was epinephrine. I extracted it. I took the residual fluid from the old pens in the recycling bin because there were none left in the cabinet." She gave him peanut butter. I saw the jar. She mixed it into his oatmeal. The accusation hung in the air for a fraction of a second before violence shattered it. Victoria lunged forward and slapped Ebony across the face. The sound was sharp and sickening, like a whip cracking in the silent room. "Liar!" Victoria screamed, her voice trembling with a performance of perfect outrage. "You are a dirty liar. The EpiPens expired last month. I threw them away myself. I ordered new ones, but they have not arrived yet. You know that. You are making this up to cover your tracks. That was not medicine. I saw the bottle in your hand. You were injecting him with rat poison." Rat poison. The words hit Julian like a physical blow. He looked from his sobbing fiancée to the maid bleeding on the floor. His mind was racing, trying to find logic in the madness. He needed to verify. He needed facts. Julian turned and sprinted into the adjoining bathroom where the emergency medical kit was kept. He ripped the mirrored door open so hard the hinges groaned. His eyes scanned the shelves. They were bare. The box of EpiPens that should have been on the middle shelf was gone. The antihistamines were gone. There was nothing but empty space. Victoria was right. The medicine was gone. He stormed back into the nursery, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Ebony was pulling herself up, using the crib for support, her hand cupping her swelling cheek. Julian marched up to her. He did not look at her face. He looked at her apron. The white uniform apron she wore had deep front pockets. One of them was sagging. There was a heavy rectangular shape weighing down the fabric. Julian did not ask. He did not hesitate. He reached out and shoved his hand into her pocket. Ebony flinched, but she was too weak to stop him. Julian's fingers closed around a small cardboard box. He pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a yellow box. The skull and crossbones symbol on the front was unmistakable. High-potency rodenticide. The world stopped. The only sound was Noah's wet, wheezing breath and Victoria's soft weeping. Julian stared at the box in his hand. It was unopened, but the seal was broken. It was the exact brand the groundskeepers used for the estate gardens. Victoria had planted it. She had slipped it into Ebony's pocket when she rushed past her moments ago. But Julian did not see the sleight of hand. He only seen the evidence. The logic was complete. The medicine cabinet was empty. The poison was in her pocket. The syringe was on the floor. Every piece of data pointed to one conclusion. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had let into his home and near his children, was a monster. Julian looked up from the box. His gaze locked onto Ebony. The warmth, the respect, the gratitude he had once felt for her vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a cold, absolute loathing. He looked at her not as a human being, but as a pathogen, a disease that had infected his sanctuary. Ebony saw the look in his eyes. It was a look of pure disgust. It was the look of a man who realized he had invited a predator into his nest. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny the poison, to explain the frame-up, but the look on his face stopped the words in her throat. She knew in that terrifying moment that no amount of truth could penetrate the wall of evidence Victoria had built against her. Julian Thorne, the man of science, had been blinded by the very proof he worshipped. "Marcus, get to the nursery immediately!" Julian barked into his phone, his voice shaking with a rage that terrified even him. "And call the police. Tell them we have an attempted murder in progress." Seconds later, heavy footsteps thundered down the hall. Marcus, the head of security, burst through the door, his gun drawn but lowered when he saw the scene. He saw his boss kneeling beside a convulsing child and the maid surrounded by evidence of poison. He did not need instructions. He saw a threat and he moved to neutralize it. Marcus holstered his weapon and lunged at Ebony. His large hands clamped onto her arms like iron vices, lifting her from the floor as if she weighed nothing. Ebony kicked and twisted her boots, skidding uselessly against the polished wood. She did not fight for her freedom. She fought to be heard. "Listen to me!" Ebony screamed, her voice tearing at her throat as Marcus dragged her backward toward the door. "Check her arms. Check the trash. She is testing drugs on them. She is using them as lab rats for her father's company, Julian. Please listen to me. Noah needs the hospital." Victoria buried her face in Julian's chest, sobbing loudly to drown out Ebony's accusations. "Do you see now, Julian?" Her voice was muffled against his shirt, vibrating with fake terror. "We were too kind. We looked past her criminal record because we wanted to give her a second chance. And this is how she repays us. She wanted to kill them. She wanted to hold them hostage for your money. She is a monster, Julian. A monster." The mention of the criminal record snapped the last thread of Julian's patience. He had overlooked a minor debt infraction to hire her, believing in redemption. Now he felt like a fool who had almost let his children die. He stood up slowly, leaving Noah in Victoria's arms. He walked toward Ebony until he was inches from her face. His eyes were dead cold. "I do not want to hear another word from your mouth," Julian said, his voice dangerously low. If you speak again, I will kill you myself. He looked at Marcus. Get her out of here. Marcus nodded, tightening his grip until Ebony winced. Where do you want her, sir? The police are 10 minutes out due to the weather. Julian glanced at the window where the Chicago blizzard was howling against the glass. It was 20 degrees below zero outside, a death sentence for anyone without shelter. But looking at his son gasping for air on the floor, Julian felt no mercy. If the police are not here in 5 minutes, throw her out the front gate, Julian said, turning his back on her. Let the storm have her. They reached the massive double doors of the main entrance. Marcus did not slow down. He was a professional, doing a job removing a threat from the premises. Ebony felt the biting draft seeping through the cracks before the door even opened. Her ribs screamed in protest with every step, and her boots skid on the polished marble. But suddenly, she stopped fighting. She dug her heels into the expensive rug, not to resist the removal, but to stabilize herself just for 1 second. She stopped thrashing. She stopped screaming. She just looked up. Across the foyer, Julian was standing there holding his weeping fiancée. He looked like a statue of judgment, cold and unyielding. Ebony locked eyes with him. She did not look like a criminal caught in the act. She did not look like a woman fearing for her life. She looked like a doctor losing a patient she had fought desperately to save. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound disappointment and a steel core of resolve that made Julian pause. Mr. Thorne, she said. Her voice was no longer a scream. It was deadly calm. It cut through the air, slicing through Victoria, as theatrical sobbing with surgical precision. You are a scientist. You built your empire on facts, not feelings. You demand data for everything you do, so do not believe me. Do not believe my words. Believe the chemistry. Julian frowned, the rage in his chest hitting a snag. What are you talking about? Keep the vomit. Ebony said her words rapid but clear. Do not. Let her clean it up. Take a sample. Run a toxicology screen specifically for neuroinhibitors and check the master suite trash can. The one in her private bathroom. Do it before the housekeeping staff arrives at 6 in the morning. If I am lying, the trash will be empty. If I am telling the truth, you will find the answers. Your heart is too blind to see. The color drained from Victoria's face so fast it looked like she had been slapped. Her sobbing stopped instantly, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated terror. She lunged forward, breaking away from Julian. Shut up! She shrieked, reaching out as if to claw at Ebony's face from across the room. Get her out, Marcus. She is lying. She is trying to confuse you, Julian. Dawn T, listen to a word she says. She is insane, Victoria's hand was inches from reaching out, but Julian caught her arm. He stopped her mid-lunge. He did not look at Victoria. He did not look at Marcus. He was staring at Ebony. For the first time, the wall of rage cracked, just a hairline fracture. Why would a guilty woman ask for a toxicology screen? Why would a murderer give him a specific timeline and location for evidence? Get her out, Julian said again. But his voice lacked the fire it had moments ago. It was hollow, mechanical. Marcus opened the door. The wind howled like a living thing waiting to devour her. Snow swirled into the grand foyer, biting at their skin. Ebony did not look back at the warmth she was losing. She did not look at the luxury that had just rejected her. She looked at Julian one last time, holding his gaze, until the heavy wood slammed shut between them. The lock clicked, the silence rushed back in. But it was different now. It was poisoned. Julian stood in the foyer. Victoria was clinging to him again, trembling, whispering about how scary it was, how glad she was that the psycho was gone, but Julian was not listening to her. He was looking at the spot on the floor where Ebony had stood, and in his mind he was already calculating. Test the vomit. Check the trash, the scientist. In him had just been woken up, and it was asking questions that love could not answer. The iron gates of the Thorne estate slammed shut with a metallic clang that sounded like a prison sentence. Ebony hit the pavement hard, her knees scraping against the ice, hidden beneath the fresh snow. The Chicago wind did not just blow it bit. It tore through her thin uniform like paper, finding her skin and freezing the sweat of her struggle instantly. She had no coat. Her purse, her phone, her ID, everything was still inside the warm house that was now a fortress against her. She curled into a ball on the sidewalk, shivering so violently her teeth clacked together. The snow was already covering her hair, turning her into just another mound of debris on the side of the road. But she did not stand up to run. She stared at the house, her vision blurring. Not from the cold, but from the terror of what was happening inside. She had failed him. Noah was alone with her. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with the static of emergency radios. The paramedics moved with a chaotic efficiency, lifting Noah's limp body onto the stretcher. His small face was pale, the oxygen mask fogging with his shallow, rapid breaths. Julian moved to follow them, his hand reaching for his son's hand, but a body blocked his path. It was Victoria. She had thrown a fur coat over her silk robe and was clinging to the side of the gurney, her face a perfect portrait of a mother's agony. "I am going with him, Julian," she sobbed loud enough for every paramedic to hear. "You have to stay here. Look at Lucas and Ava. They are traumatized. They need their father right now. You cannot leave them alone after what that psycho just did." It was a logical argument. It was the right thing to do. But Julian did not see the calculation in her eyes. He did not know she needed to be in that ambulance not to hold Noah's hand, but to control the doctors. To make sure no one asked why a child with a peanut allergy had peanut oil on his lips. To make sure the narrative of the poisoning stuck before the toxicology report could prove her wrong. "Go," Julian said, his voice hollow. "Just save him." The ambulance doors slammed shut. The sirens wailed, fading into the whiteout of the storm. Julian stood alone in the grand foyer. The house was silent again, but the silence was heavy now. It was suffocating. He turned away from the door, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the night. He looked down at the floor. Right there on the expensive Persian rug was a dark, wet stain. A puddle of melted snow and mud where Ebony had stood just minutes ago. It was the only trace she had left behind. Then he saw it. Resting in the center of the puddle was a small, folded piece of paper. It must have fallen from her apron pocket when Marcus dragged her out. Julian stared at it. His jaw tightened. He expected it to be something damning, a lottery ticket, a pawn shop receipt, a note from a debt collector proving she was desperate enough to hurt his children for money. He bent down and picked it up. The paper was damp, the blue ink starting to bleed into the white fiber. He unfolded it. It was not a debt note. It was not a threat. It was a formula. Julian's eyes scanned the scribbled handwriting. It was medical shorthand, but he recognized the variables: body weight, heart rate, dosage calculations. It was a precise equation for administering epinephrine to a child weighing 40 pounds. He froze. His scientific mind processed the data before his emotions could catch up. These were not the notes of a killer. A killer does not calculate the exact milligram needed to restart a heart without causing cardiac arrest. A killer does not do the math to save a life. He looked at the paper, then at the door where the storm was raging. The rage that had fueled him moments ago began to cool, replaced by a cold, sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. Why would she have this? Why would she be calculating a cure if she was the one administering the poison? For the first time since he walked into the nursery, the absolute certainty of his judgment cracked. He looked at the wet paper again, and the numbers stared back at him like an accusation he was not ready to face. The wind on the south side of Chicago did not just blow, it cut. It sliced through the thin fabric of Ebony's Maid uniform like a razor blade, finding the bone and settling there with a deep, aching chill. She had walked for 3 miles. The buses had stopped running due to the storm, and she did not have the fare for a taxi, even if one dared to venture into this neighborhood. Her canvas shoes were soaked through. turning her toes into blocks of ice that she could barely feel hitting the pavement. She stumbled, clutching her ribs where Julian had shoved her. The physical pain was sharp, but the memory of his eyes hurt worse. He looked at her like she was filth. But she was not filth. She was a healer. As the snow blinded her vision, memories flashed like fever dreams. She saw the sterile, bright lights of the university library. She saw the stack of textbooks she used to devour in a single night. She was top of her class at Northwestern Medical School. She was 6 months away from her residency. 6 months away from becoming Dr. Davis. But then the phone calls started. Her father's gambling debts, the loans that defaulted. The day the dean called her into his office and told her that her tuition check had bounced for the third time, she had lost her future to pay for her father. As mistakes. She took the job at the Thorne estate, not because she wanted to clean toilets, but because the first time she held baby Noah, he stopped crying. She recognized the signs of neglect in those children immediately. She stayed because she knew if she left, no one else would notice the bruises or the strange lethargy. She stayed because she loved them more than she loved her own pride. Ebony's knees buckled, and she fell hard onto the icy sidewalk. The world spun. Darkness crept into the edges of her vision, seducing her, promising her warmth, if she just closed her eyes. But then she heard the phantom sound of Noah gasping for air. She forced herself up, screaming silently at her own body to move. She could not die. Tonight. Not while the truth was still locked in her head. She reached her building, a crumbling brick tenement that smelled of wet concrete and old garbage. She dragged herself up the 3 flights of stairs, her hand leaving a smear of blood on the railing. When she reached her door, she stopped. The handle was wrapped in a thick, heavy chain. A bright orange eviction sticker was plastered across the wood, at eye level. Her landlord had finally done it. He had locked her out in the middle of a blizzard. Panic rose in her throat, choking her. Everything she owned was in there, but she did not care about her clothes or her furniture. She needed the box under her bed. She needed the evidence. Ebony looked around the hallway. It was empty. She grabbed a loose brick that propped open the stairwell door. With a primal grunt of frustration, she smashed the brick against the old wood of the door frame near the lock. Splinters flew. She struck it again and again, channeling every ounce of her rage and fear into the blows. The wood gave way with a loud crack. She kicked the door open and stumbled into the freezing dark of her apartment. She did not turn on the lights. She crawled across the floor to her mattress and ripped it aside. There it was, a battered metal lockbox. Her hands shook so badly she could barely work the combination. When the lid popped open, she let out a sob of relief. Inside was her stethoscope, her blood pressure cuff, and a few vials of basic medicine. But beneath the tools lay a black leather notebook. She pulled it out and flipped it open. The pages were filled with her handwriting, detailed clinical observations. November 4th. Lucas, lethargic after breakfast, pupils dilated. November 10th. Ava complains of bugs crawling on her skin after drinking juice provided by Victoria. November 15th. Noah vomiting bile consistent with chemical ingestion. This was not just a diary. It was a crime scene log. It was the proof that she was not crazy. It was the only thing that could save those children from the woman who was slowly killing them. Ebony shoved the book into her shirt against her skin. She grabbed the medical box and stood up. She had to move. She had to survive the night because tomorrow she was going to war. The sterile fluorescent light of the private hospital suite hummed with a sound that grated against Julian's nerves like sandpaper. He stood at the foot of the bed watching the rise and fall of Noah's small chest. The 4-year-old was pale, his skin translucent against the white sheets, but the convulsions had stopped. The monitors showed a steady rhythm, a rhythm that should have brought the father peace, but instead brought a gnawing suspicion. Dr. Vance, a man with a polished smile and eyes that shifted too quickly, stood by the door holding a clipboard. He was not the on-call emergency physician. He was the family specialist. Victoria had insisted on calling immediately. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. It appears to be a severe case of acute bacterial gastroenteritis. Dr. Vance said, his tone smooth and rehearsed, likely caused by contamination. The toxicology screen came back negative for any common household poisons. It seems your maid simply failed to wash her hands or the utensils properly. Fecal matter in the food preparation area is more common than you think with low-skilled labor. Julian stared at the doctor. Food poisoning. It was a convenient answer, a simple answer. It explained the vomiting. It explained the distress, but it did not explain the peanut oil on Noah's lips, and it did not explain why the doctor was sweating despite the chill in the room. "Thank you, doctor," Julian said, his voice flat. "Keep him monitored." Victoria sighed loudly, walking over to the doctor and placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you so much, Arthur. You saved him." She turned to Julian, her eyes wide and wet with fresh tears. "See, Julian. It is exactly what I said. She is filthy. She almost killed him with her negligence. We are lucky. It was not worse." Julian did not answer. He looked past her to the corner of the room where Lucas and Ava sat on a leather love seat. They were not coloring. They were not playing on the tablets he had brought them. They were sitting perfectly still, their knees pulled up to their chests, watching Victoria with the eyes of prey, watching a predator. Victoria walked toward them, her heels clicking on the linoleum. "Oh, my poor babies," she cooed, reaching out to stroke Ava's hair. "You must be so scared. Mommy is here now." Ava flinched. It was a small movement, a violent recoil, as if she expected to be struck. Lucas grabbed his sister's hand and squeezed it so hard his knuckles turned white. They did not look at her with love. They looked at her with absolute terror. Julian saw it. He saw the way they shrank into the leather, trying to make themselves invisible. He saw the way they looked at Victoria's hands, not as a source of comfort, but as a source of pain. "You have to sue her, Julian," Victoria said, standing up and turning her back on the terrified children. Her voice hardened, losing its weeping edge. "You have to call the district attorney right now. Press full charges. I want her in prison. I want her life over. She is a danger to society." "Julian, do it tonight. Do not let her get away with this." She was pushing too hard. She was too eager. The urgency in her voice did not sound like a mother seeking justice. It sounded like a criminal seeking a cover-up. "Why are you so focused on her?" Julian asked quietly, his eyes narrowing. "Why aren't you focused on Noah?" Victoria froze for a split second before recovering. "Because she hurt him, Julian. Because I am angry." But the crack had formed. The aggressive demand for a lawsuit, the dismissal of the children's fear, the doctor's convenient diagnosis, it all swirled in Julian's mind, colliding with the image of Ebony standing in the snow. And then her voice echoed in his memory, clear and sharp as a blade. "Check the trash can in the master suite." Julian looked at Victoria, at her perfect hair and her perfect makeup that had somehow survived a night of chaos. He looked at his terrified children, and for the first time he realized the monster might not be the woman he threw out into the cold. The monster might be the one demanding he lock the door behind her. The digital clock on the dashboard of the SUV glowed a neon green, reading 3:14 in the morning. Julian parked the car at the bottom of the driveway, leaving the engine off. He did not want the headlights to sweep across the house. He did not want the night staff to know he had returned. He felt like a criminal breaking into his own fortress. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence left in its wake was heavy and oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards as he entered the foyer sounded like a gunshot to his frayed nerves. He climbed the grand staircase in the dark, his hand gripping the banister tightly. He bypassed his own bedroom and headed straight for the guest suite Victoria claimed as her private sanctuary. She always insisted on privacy, locking the door whenever she left. But Julian was the owner of the estate, and he had the master key. The metal slid into the lock with a soft click that echoed in the empty hallway. He pushed the door open. The room smelled of her perfume, a heavy floral scent that used to intoxicate him. Now it made his stomach turn. He did not turn on the lights. The moonlight reflecting off the snow outside provided enough illumination. He walked straight to the ensuite bathroom, his boots heavy on the marble tile. There it was, the small chrome pedal bin in the corner. The object Ebony had pinned her entire defense on. Check the trash can in the master suite. Julian stared at it for a long moment, terrified of what he might find, terrified of what it would mean if he found nothing. If the bin was empty, Ebony was a liar, and he had almost killed an innocent woman. If the bin was full, his entire life was a lie. He stepped on the pedal, the lid hissed open. At first glance, it was just tissues and makeup wipes. Julian reached in his hands, trembling. He pushed past the surface layer, and his fingers brushed against sharp foil. He pulled it out. It was a blister pack. Empty. The label read, Zolpidem. 10 milligrams, a powerful sedative. He dug deeper. Another pack. Another dozens of empty foil casings, enough to tranquilize a large animal, or keep 3 small children in a state of perpetual lethargy for weeks. His heart hammered against his ribs, but drugs alone were not proof of malice. She could claim insomnia. He needed more. He reached to the bottom of the bin and his fingers closed around a ball of crumpled paper. He smoothed it out on the cold vanity counter. It was a document, a final notice from a private lending firm in Las Vegas. The amount due was staggering. $2 million. The name on the debt was not Victoria's, it was her father's. A gambling debt that had been called in with a threat of asset seizure attached to the bottom. The motive crystallized in Julian's mind. She was broke, her family was drowning, and she was using his children as leverage to secure her position and his money. But the final item at the very bottom of the bin shattered him completely. It was a silk handkerchief embroidered with the initials VSJ. It was stiff-crusted with a dried substance. Julian lifted it to his nose. The smell was faint, but undeniable. It was the sour scent of bile, mixed with the sweet, oily aroma of peanut butter. This was the cloth she had used to wipe Noah's mouth. She had told the paramedics she cleaned him up to help him breathe. But if that were true, she would have given this cloth to the doctors to help them identify the toxin. Instead, she had hidden it. She had buried the evidence of the peanut butter deep in her personal trash, waiting to dispose of it permanently. Julian gripped the dirty silk until his knuckles turned white. The doubt was gone. The scientist in him had the data. The father in him had the rage. Victoria had not just watched his son die, she had actively prevented his rescue. She was the poison, and now he had the antidote in his hand. The black SUV tore down the empty highway, the engine roaring against the silence of the pre-dawn morning. Julian drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting protectively on the passenger seat where the plastic evidence bag lay. Inside was the soiled silk handkerchief, the only witness to the crime that had nearly claimed his son. He could have driven to the hospital. He could have handed it to Dr. Vance. But trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Vance was Victoria's creature. If Julian wanted the truth, he had to find it himself in the one place where lies could not survive under the microscope. He pulled up to the glass monolith of Thorne Biotech at 4 a.m. The security guard, startled by the arrival of the CEO in the middle of a blizzard, scrambled to open the gate. Julian did not wave. He drove straight to the underground loading dock, bypassing the lobby. He needed total isolation. Inside the private laboratory, the air was scrubbed and cold-smelling of ozone and ethanol. Julian stripped off his heavy coat and pulled on a white lab coat. For the first time in years, he was not Julian Thorne, the billionaire investor. He was Dr. Thorne, the biochemist. His hand stopped shaking the moment he picked up the pipette. He cut a small swatch from the stained handkerchief and submerged it in a solvent solution. He placed the sample into the centrifuge, watching it spin a blur of motion that matched the chaos in his mind. He transferred the extracted solution to the mass spectrometer. The machine hummed to life, a low, steady drone that filled the empty room. Julian stood over the monitor, his arms crossed, his eyes burning with fatigue and fear. He watched the graph lines spike and fall, translating the chemical composition of the stain into raw data. The first spike appeared on the screen almost immediately. Arachis hypogaea, peanut oil. The concentration was high. Ebony had been telling the truth. Noah had ingested peanut butter, and Victoria had wiped it away to hide the cause of the anaphylaxis. That alone was attempted murder. But as the analysis continued, a second spike appeared on the graph, a darker, more complex chemical signature that should not have been there. Julian leaned in closer, his breath fogging the screen. He recognized the molecular structure. It was a synthetic compound, a heavy neural inhibitor known as NeuroX. It was an experimental drug developed for severe trauma patients to induce a coma-like state. It was highly volatile, illegal for use outside of clinical trials, and absolutely forbidden for children under 12 due to the risk of permanent brain damage and muscle atrophy. The sun began to crest over the Chicago skyline, casting a blood-red glow into the lab, but Julian felt only ice in his veins. The lethargy, the glossed-over look in Lucas's eyes, the way Ava sat motionless for hours. They were not just well-behaved children, they were sedated. Victoria was not just neglecting them, she was dosing them. She was using his children as test subjects, likely feeding data back to her father's failing pharmaceutical company to pay off the debts he had found in the trash. His children were not family to her. They were lab rats. Julian gripped the edge of the steel table so hard the metal groaned. A primal scream built in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Screaming would not save them. Ebony was out there somewhere, freezing and hunted because she had tried to stop this. He had thrown the only person who actually loved his children into the snow. He grabbed the evidence bag and the printout of the results. He was done being a scientist. Now it was time to be a father. The vibration of the phone in Victoria's pocket felt like a bomb ticking down seconds to detonation. She stood in the sterile white corridor of the hospital, watching the nurses fuss over Lucas and Ava through the glass observation window. Dr. Vance walked past her, his face the color of ash. He did not stop. He did not look at her. He just whispered one sentence out of the side of his mouth as he hurried toward the elevator. He took the handkerchief. Victoria. He knows. Victoria froze. The air in the hallway seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum of panic. Julian had the handkerchief. Julian was a biochemist with a private lab. He would not just find peanut oil, he would find the compound. It was over. The game was up, unless she stopped the only other person who could connect the dots. She turned on her heel and marched into the emergency stairwell, her heels clicking like gunshots on the concrete. She pulled out a burner phone, the one she used to negotiate her father's gambling debts. Her fingers trembled as she dialed a number she had sworn never to use again. It connected to the dark underbelly of Chicago, to men who saw human life as a line item on a ledger. The voice on the other end was deep, gravelly, and unbothered. "Yeah, he knows," Victoria hissed, her voice echoing in the concrete shaft. "But he does not have the full picture yet. The maid does. She is the loose end. She knows about the NeuroX. She saw me dosing them." "What do you want?" the voice asked, bored. "I want her gone," Victoria said, her voice twisting into a snarl that would have terrified her social media followers. "She is out there somewhere in the city. Find her. Make her silent. Permanently. I will pay double the interest on the loan this month. Just do it. Consider it done." The line went dead. Victoria lowered the phone, her hand trembling not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline. She checked her reflection in the safety glass of the door. She fixed a stray hair. She practiced her crying face. Then she walked back into the ward, ready to play the grieving mother one last time. Miles away. The Harold Washington Library Center was a fortress of silence, a sanctuary for the lost and the cold. Ebony sat at a public terminal in the back corner, huddled deep inside her oversized hoodie, trying to disappear. Her fingers flew across the sticky keyboard, her eyes darting between the screen and the door. She was searching for side effects: muscle atrophy, memory loss, seizures. The search results for NeuroX flashed on the screen, confirming her worst nightmares. It was a military-grade inhibitor. Victoria was not just drugging them, she was erasing them. Ebony hit print. The sound of the machine startlingly loud in the quiet room. She reached for the paper, but her hand froze. The reflection in the dark window of the library caught her eye. Two men were standing by the reference desk. They were not looking at books. They were wearing thick leather jackets that looked too heavy for reading. One of them was scanning the room with cold, dead eyes, stopped when he saw her. He tapped the other man's shoulder and pointed. Ebony's heart slammed against her bruised ribs. They were not security guards, they were hunters. She grabbed the paper and her medical box. She did not run immediately. That would draw attention. She stood up slowly, keeping her head down. She moved toward the stacks, calculating the distance to the emergency exit. The men started moving. They split up, flanking the aisles to cut her off. The hunt had begun. Ebony shoved a heavy cart of returned books into the narrow aisle, creating a momentary barricade between her and the approaching men. She did not run blindly. She knew this building. She knew that the main elevators were a choke point and the grand lobby was too open. She remembered the service stairwell behind the reference desk, the one the librarians used to take smoke breaks. It led directly to the alleyway, bypassing the security checkpoints. She sprinted, staying low, weaving through the stacks of periodicals. The men shouted. Behind her, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet, Ebony burst through the service door and slammed the crash bar. The cold air of the alley hit her face like a slap. She did not stop. She turned left toward the neon blue sign of the CTA subway station. The stairs were slick with ice, but she took them two at a time, her hand gripping the freezing metal rail. The sound of the service door banging open echoed above her. They were fast. She reached the turnstiles. Her fingers were numb as she dug for her transit card. She could hear them pounding down the concrete stairs behind her. She jammed the card against the reader, but it flashed red. Insufficient fare. She did not have time to think. She placed her hands on the metal bar and vaulted over it, landing hard on the other side just as the two men reached the gate. She scrambled down to the platform. The tunnel was dark and smelled of ozone and wet wool. The rumble of an approaching train vibrated through the soles of her shoes. It was coming, but it was not fast enough. She looked back. The men had jumped the turnstiles. One of them, the larger one with the scar, was reaching into his jacket. Ebony backed away toward the edge of the platform, praying for the doors to open. The train screeched into the station, a blur of silver and light. The doors hissed open. Ebony lunged forward, but a hand clamped onto the strap of her shoulder bag. It was a violent jerk that snapped her head back. The man had her. He pulled her toward him, his grip tightening on the leather strap, pulling her away from safety. Ebony looked at the open doors, then at the man's face twisted in a cruel grin. She had a split-second choice. The bag held her wallet, her state ID, her nursing license, and the little cash she had left. It was her identity. It was her life. But the doors were starting to close. She twisted her body and shrugged her shoulder, letting the strap slide down her arm. The sudden release of tension sent the man stumbling backward. The bag flew into his hands. Ebony fell forward, landing on the dirty floor of the train car, just as the rubber edges of the door slammed shut. The train jerked into motion, leaving the men standing on the platform, staring at her through the glass. Ebony scrambled backward away from the window, breathing in jagged gasps. She watched the man holding her bag. He rifled through it, pulling out her wallet. He looked up at her and smiled, tapping his temple as the train sped into the darkness. She collapsed against the wall, hugging her knees to her chest. She had the medical box. She had the notebook tucked safe inside her shirt. But that was all. She was no longer just homeless. She was a ghost. She had no name, no money, and no way to prove who she was. In the eyes of the city, Ebony Davis had ceased to exist. She was just another shadow on the train riding the loop to nowhere, while the hunters held the keys to her past. The security control room in the Thorne estate was a cold, windowless bunker buried deep within the foundation. Marcus sat, bathed in the blue glow of 12 different monitors, his eyes scanning lines of code that scrolled like waterfalls down the center screen. He was the head of security, a man paid to see everything. But tonight he felt blind. He had dragged a woman out into a blizzard based on what he saw in the nursery. But his gut had been twisting ever since. The way Ebony had looked at him, the desperation in her voice. It did not sit right. Victoria had demanded access to the server room 2 days ago, claiming she lost a diamond earring and wanted to check the feeds Marcus had let her in against protocol. Now he was looking at the logs for that time slot. There were gaps, huge chunks of missing data from the internal cameras inside the children's suite. She had deleted them, but Victoria was a socialite, not a hacker. She had dragged the files to the trash bin, but she had not scrubbed the drive. Marcus ran the recovery algorithm, watching the progress bar crawl toward 100%. A file popped up, time-stamped 3 days ago. Marcus clicked play. The graininess of the night vision camera did not hide the truth. It showed the nursery in the dead of night. Lucas, the quietest of the triplets, was crying softly in his crib. The door opened and Ebony stepped in. She did not look angry. She looked exhausted. She lifted the boy from the crib, rocking him gently against her chest. She began to hum a lullaby, her hand rubbing his back with a tenderness that made Marcus look away in shame. But the video was not over. In the corner of the frame, half hidden by the heavy velvet curtains, a shadow moved. It was Victoria. She was not sleeping. She was watching. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the child and the maid, like a scientist observing a lab experiment. She was holding her phone, the screen illuminating her face with a harsh white light. She was not calling for help. She was typing. Marcus zoomed in, enhancing the resolution. The reflection in the window glass was faint but legible. She was logging. Data. Heart rate elevated. Tremors. Visible. Subject agitated. Marcus felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had thrown the wrong woman into the snow. He grabbed the tablet and sprinted up the stairs, taking the steps 3 at a time. He needed to find Julian. He found him in the library, staring at a chemical printout, his face a mask of horror. Marcus slammed the tablet onto the desk, destroying the silence. "Boss, you need to see this." I recovered the deleted feeds. She was not hurting them. She was the only one holding them. Julian watched the footage. He saw Ebony's love. He saw Victoria's cold calculation. He saw the monster standing in the shadows of his own home. The chemical report in his hand told him what Victoria had done. The video told him who she really was. Guilt crashed into him like a tidal wave. "Where is she?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Where is Ebony?" Marcus looked down, his jaw tight. "She is gone, sir. I put her out the front gate hours ago, but I have contacts in the city." There is chatter. A hit has been put out on a woman matching her description. Julian stood up, the chair crashing backward onto the floor. His eyes were wild, terrified. "Find her, Marcus. Turn this city upside down. Track her phone. Run facial recognition on every street camera. I do not care what it costs. You find her before they do, and you bring her back to me safe. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, pulling his radio from his belt. "Copy that, sir. We are moving out." Julian turned to the window, staring out into the black night. The storm was still raging, covering the tracks of the innocent and the guilty alike. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, whispering a prayer he had not said in years. "Please be alive. Just stay alive until I get there." The GPS tracker on Marcus's tablet led them to the far end of the city where the streetlights flickered and the snow piled up in gray drifts of slush. Julian ordered the driver to stop 3 blocks away. He did not want the roar of an engine to frighten her. He did not want to arrive as a billionaire in a fortress of steel. He opened the door and stepped out into the freezing wind, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the ice. He needed to walk this. He needed to feel the cold that he had sentenced her to. He found her curled into the corner of a graffiti-covered bus shelter. The plastic walls were cracked, offering no protection from the wind. She looked like a pile of discarded laundry. Her knees were pulled to her chest, her head buried in her arms. She was not moving. The layer of snow on her shoulders told him she had been there for a long time. Julian approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Ebony," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. He stepped closer and knelt on the dirty concrete. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her shoulder. Ebony gasped violently, her body jerking as if she had been electrocuted. She scrambled backward, her boots scraping against the pavement, trying to push herself into the wall. Her eyes were wide with terror, pupil-dilated adrenaline flooding her exhausted system. She did not see a savior. She saw the man who had thrown her out to die. She saw the monster who believed a liar over her. "Please," she whimpered, raising her hands to protect her face. "I did not do it. I swear, I did not hurt them. Just let me go." Julian felt his soul crack. He tore off his heavy wool coat, exposing himself to the biting chill. He did not care about the cold. He wrapped the coat around her trembling frame, pulling it tight. Ebony flinched, trying to shove him away, trying to run, but her legs were too frozen to support her weight. She slipped, and Julian caught her. His grip was firm but gentle, anchoring her to the ground. "I know," Julian said, his voice breaking. "I know you did not do it." Ebony, "Stop running. I went to the lab. I tested the handkerchief. I found the peanut oil. And I found the Neuro X. You were right. You were right about everything." Ebony went still. The fight drained out of her, leaving only exhaustion. She stared at him, her breath hitching in her chest. She searched his face for a lie, for a trick, but she saw only raw, unfiltered regret. The snow fell between them, landing on his eyelashes, melting on his cheeks that were wet with tears. "I am so sorry." Julian choked out the words, tasting like ash. "I failed you. I failed them. I was blind." He expected her to scream. He expected her to spit in his face or demand money, or curse him for the pain in her ribs. But Ebony did not do any of those things. She did not ask for an apology. She did not ask if she had her job back. She did not even ask if she was safe. She grabbed the lapels of his coat, her fingers digging into the fabric, and looked him in the eye with a terrifying intensity. "How is Noah?" she asked. Her voice was a rasp, a whisper of pure concern. "Is he alive? Did the epinephrine work?" The question hit Julian harder than any physical blow could have. She was freezing, starving, and hunted by killers. Yet her first thought, her only thought, was for the child of the man who had ruined her life. It was a level of selflessness he did not understand, a level of love he did not deserve. He looked at this woman shivering in the dirt and realized she was the only real parent his children had ever known. "He is alive," Julian whispered, tears spilling over. "He is safe because of you." Ebony exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she closed her eyes and let herself lean into the warmth of the coat. Julian pulled her close, shielding her from the wind, vowing silently that he would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt her again. The penthouse apartment in downtown Chicago was sterile and white, a stark contrast to the Gothic heaviness of the Thorne estate. But it was warm, and it was safe. Julian locked the heavy steel door behind them, engaging the security bolts. He watched Ebony sink into a beige sofa, still wrapped in his coat, clutching her medical box, like it contained the crown jewels. She was shivering less now, but her eyes were still haunted shadows against her skin. He poured her a glass of water and set it down. She drank it in one long gulp, then reached into her shirt and pulled out the black leather notebook. It was battered, the corners bent, but she handled it with reverence. "This is why I stayed," she whispered, opening the book with trembling fingers. "I started tracking it 3 months ago when Lucas stopped eating." She pushed the book across the coffee table. Julian picked it up. The entries were clinical, precise, written with the discipline of the medical student she used to be. Day 1, Lucas vomiting bile after ingesting what Victoria calls magic water. Day 5, Ava screaming about bugs on her skin, hallucinating for 3 hours, pupils fixed and dilated. Day 12, Noah, lethargic, unresponsive to pain stimuli after breakfast. Ebony pointed to the entry about the magic water. "She puts a pink powder in their juice. She tells them it will make them strong like superheroes, but 10 minutes later, they can barely lift their heads. I tried to take a sample once, but she caught me. She threatened to call the police and say I was stealing." Silver. Julian felt the bile rise in his throat. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out the crumpled debt notice he had retrieved from the trash. He placed it next to the notebook. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening click. $2 million owed to a private lending firm. The debt was in the name of Franklin St. James, Victoria's father. He owns St. James Pharmaceuticals. Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. They have been trying to get FDA approval for a pediatric version of NeuroX for years. It has been stuck in phase 1 trials because of severe side effects in animal subjects. They lost their funding 6 months ago. Ebony looked at the debt notice, then at Julian. Her eyes widened with horror. She is not just hurting them. She is testing the drug on them. She is using them to generate data to prove it is safe so her father, can sell the patent and pay off the debt. Julian stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal. It was not just madness. It was business. She had turned his children into lab rats to save her family. Fortune, the lethargy, the vomiting, the hallucinations, they were all documented side effects of NeuroX toxicity. And she was recording it all, feeding the results back to her father while playing the loving stepmother to the cameras. "We have the medical logs," Julian said, pointing to Ebony's book, "and we have the financial motive. But it is circumstantial. In court, a good lawyer could argue, you forged the diary, and I am a grieving father looking for a scapegoat. We need more. We need to catch her doing it." Ebony closed the notebook, her expression hardening. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold determination. "Then we have to go back. She is throwing a gala tomorrow night to launch her own charity foundation. She will want the children there as props, and if I know Victoria, she will dose them before they go on stage. So they are perfect little dolls." Julian looked at her. "You cannot go back there," Marcus said. "There is a hit on you." Ebony stood up, facing him. "I am the only one who knows where she hides the powder. If we want to save them, we have to walk right back into the lion's den. And this time we do not knock." "We need a confession," Julian said, pacing the small living room of the safe house, his voice tight with frustration. "The medical logs are strong, but a good defense attorney will tear them apart. They will say you forged them. They will say the chemical traces on the handkerchief were environmental contamination. We need to see her put the powder in the cup, and we need to hear her say why she is doing it." Ebony sat at the table staring at the gala invitation Julian had thrown down. It was embossed with gold foil. The Little Angels fundraiser hosted by Victoria St. James. The irony tasted like bile in her throat. Victoria was throwing a party to raise money for orphans while turning the children in her care into ghosts. She will dose them before the speeches. Ebony set her finger tracing the gold lettering. She needs them perfect for the cameras. She needs them to stand still and smile and not cry for their mother. She always gives them the special juice exactly 30 minutes before they go on stage. That is our window. Julian stopped pacing. He looked at the invitation, then at Ebony. The plan forming in his mind was reckless. It was dangerous. It required putting the woman he had already failed back into the line of fire, but he saw no other way. The catering company, Julian said quietly. Elite events. I own the parent company. I can get you on the roster. You will not be Ebony the fired maid. You will be just another server in a black vest and a mask passing hors d'oeuvres. No one looks at the help. Victoria certainly does not. She looks through them like they are glass. Ebony nodded slowly. She knew he was right. To Victoria, servants were furniture tools to be used and discarded. She would never expect the woman she tried to kill to be pouring her champagne. Marcus can rig a button camera on your vest. Julian continued, his mind shifting into tactical mode, and a micro recorder. We need clear audio. If we can catch her mixing the Neuro X and talking about the debt we have her, but you cannot be caught. Ebony, if her security team identifies you, they will not throw you out this time. They will take you somewhere quiet, and I will not be able to stop them. I am not afraid of her security, Ebony said, her voice steady. I am afraid of what happens if we do nothing. What about you? You have to play your part too. I will be the distraction, Julian said grimly. I have to play the loving fiancé one last time. I have to keep her stressed, keep her focused on the image so she makes a mistake. I will push her about the children's behavior, make her nervous so she feels the need to up the dosage, and then I will pave the way for you to get into the nursery. It was a house of cards. One wrong move, one slip of a mask, and it would all collapse. But as Ebony looked at the billionaire, who was willing to destroy his own engagement to save his children, she knew they had no choice. The gala was tomorrow night, the champagne would be flowing, the cameras would be rolling, and in the shadows of the nursery, a war was about to begin. The drive back to the estate felt like a funeral procession for Julian's soul. He parked the car and forced his facial muscles into a mask of apology. He walked into the master bedroom, where Victoria was lounging on the chaise, reviewing the seating chart for the gala. She looked up, her eyes scanning him for any sign of betrayal. Julian forced a smile that felt like it was tearing his face apart. He walked over to the woman who was poisoning his children, and he leaned down. He kissed her. Her lips were soft, and she tasted of expensive mint tea. To anyone watching, it was a tender reconciliation. To Julian, it was a violation. His stomach churned with a physical nausea so violent, he almost gagged. He pulled away slowly, fighting the urge to wipe his mouth. I am sorry about the other night, he lied, his voice smooth and steady. I was stressed, the storm, the business deal. I took it out on you? Victoria smiled, but her eyes remained cold and calculating, like a shark assessing prey in the water. She reached up and stroked his cheek. I know you did not mean it, darling, she cooed. You just need to listen to me more often. I only want what is best for the children. Julian nodded, suppressing the urge to scream. He told her he needed to check on the event setup and walked out. As soon as he turned the corner, his hand flew to his mouth and he dry heaved against the wall. The performance was working, but the cost was agonizing. Miles away in the back of a nondescript van, Marcus was threading a thin wire through the lining of a catering vest. Ebony stood perfectly still, her arms held out. Marcus S. Hands were steady as he replaced the second button from the top with a high-definition lens, no bigger than a pinhead. Do not touch it, Marcus instructed, his voice low and serious. The microphone is taped to the inside of the collar. It is sensitive enough to pick up a whisper across the room. If she speaks, you will hear it. If she mixes the powder, you will see it. But Ebony, you have to be careful. This transmits a live feed to Julian's phone and my tablet. If you cover the lens, we go blind. Ebony nodded, fastening the vest. It felt like armor. She was not a maid anymore. She was a soldier, going behind enemy lines. I understand, she said. I will get the shot. Back at the mansion. Victoria stood by the window watching Julian's car drive away toward the guest house. She narrowed her eyes. The apology was perfect. Too perfect. Julian was a man of science, not a man of easy submission. His sudden capitulation did not sit right with her. It felt rehearsed. She pulled her phone from her robe pocket and dialed the head of the private security firm she had hired to supplement Marcus's team. The call connected. Instantly, I want full background checks on every single person entering this property tomorrow night. Victoria ordered, her voice sharp. The caterers, the florists, the sound technicians. I want their IDs scanned and their bags searched. If anyone looks suspicious, if anyone does not match their paperwork, you throw them out. No exceptions. She hung up and stared at the empty driveway. She did not know what Julian was planning, but she was not going to let anyone ruin her big night. The walls were going up, and the gap for Ebony to slip through was closing fast. The Thorne estate was not just a house tonight. It was a stage. The massive iron gates were thrown wide open, welcoming a parade of black limousines that snaked down the snow-lined driveway. The facade of the mansion was bathed in warm golden uplighting, turning the gray stone into a palace of amber and shadow. Inside the ballroom was a sea of diamonds and tuxedos. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh orchids imported from the tropics. Reporters from every major network were corralled behind velvet ropes, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, hungry for the perfect shot of the billionaire. And his philanthropic fiancé, Julian, stood at the center of the chaos. Holding a flute of champagne, he had no intention of drinking. He smiled until his face hurt, shaking hands with senators and tech moguls, accepting their congratulations on his engagement and his charity work. But his eyes were not on the guests. They were darting toward the service doors, scanning the sea of black vests, moving through the crowd. He was terrified. One wrong look, one slip of a mask, and the woman he had sent into the fire would be discovered. Down at the service entrance, the air was freezing and smelled of diesel exhaust. A catering van idled by the loading dock, disgorging crates of lobster and Wagyu beef. Ebony stepped out of the back of the van. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might dislodge the tiny camera hidden in her button. She wore a coarse black wig that itched against her neck and a heavy N95 mask that covered half her face. She kept her head down, clutching a tray of empty glasses. The security checkpoint was tighter than an airport. 2 guards with scanners stood by the door, checking IDs against a digital list. Ebony stepped forward, her legs feeling like lead. One of the guards, a man she did not recognize, stepped in front of her. "Hold it! Let me see your badge." Before Ebony could freeze, Marcus appeared from the shadows. He looked authoritative and bored, checking his watch. "Let her through," he barked, snapping his fingers. "We are down 2 servers in the main hall, and the lady of the house is already screaming about the champagne flow. Move it!" The guard hesitated, then stepped back, waving Ebony through. She walked past him, her breath caught in her throat, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen chaos. She was in, but being inside was only the first step. The real danger was just beginning. Upstairs in the master. Upstairs. Suite. Victoria St. James was applying a final coat of red lipstick in the mirror. She looked flawless, a vision in emerald green silk, but her hands were trembling with a manic energy. She checked her phone. No messages from the creditors yet. She just needed to get through tonight. She needed the donation checks to clear. She turned to the 2 temporary nannies she had hired for the evening. "Bring them down in 20 minutes. Victoria ordered, her voice sharp. "Do not let them touch anything, and do not let them mess up their clothes. If they cry, you deal with it. I want them smiling when they walk onto that stage." She dismissed the nannies and picked up her clutch inside, Hidden in a secret lining was a small glass vial of pink powder. She slipped out of the room and headed for the private prep kitchen adjacent to the ballroom. She needed privacy to prepare the cocktail that would turn the triplets into the perfect silent props she needed them to be. She pushed through the swinging doors, her eyes scanning the room to ensure she was alone, unaware that a new server in a black wig was watching from the shadows. The prep kitchen was a stainless steel maze of steam and shouting chefs, but the private pantry in the back was quiet. Too quiet. Ebony slipped through the swinging doors, her grip on the silver tray tightening until her knuckles turned white. She saw her Victoria stood by the granite island, her back to the door, arranging 3 small crystal glasses of apple juice. The sight made Ebony's blood run cold. Next to the juice was the small glass vial, the pink powder glowing ominously under the halogen lights. Ebony angled her chest, ensuring the button camera on her vest had a clear line of sight. Victoria uncorked the vial. She tipped it over the first glass, then the second, then the third. The powder hissed as it hit the liquid, dissolving instantly into the amber fluid. Invisible, tasteless, deadly. Ebony held her breath, praying the lens was capturing the resolution needed to prove this was not sugar. She needed to swap them. She needed to knock the tray over. She needed to do something before those drinks reached the children. Victoria stirred the drinks with a silver spoon, humming a soft tune. The sound of the spoon clinking against the glass was the only noise in the room. Ebony took a step back, trying to retreat unseen, to formulate a plan to intercept the tray in the hallway, but her shoe squeaked against the wet tile. Victoria spun around her green silk dress, swishing around her legs. Her eyes narrowed instantly, locking onto Ebony's face above the mask. She did not look at the uniform. She looked at the eyes. "What are you doing lurking there?" Victoria snapped. Her voice was sharp, suspicious. She took a step closer, ignoring the tray in Ebony's hands. "Wait." She tilted her head, her gaze drilling into Ebony's eyes. "I know you. I have seen those eyes before. You look familiar. Take off that mask." Panic exploded in Ebony's chest. She could not reveal her face. She could not let Victoria hear her real voice. If she was identified now, the security would drag her to the basement, and the evidence would disappear along with her. She hunched her shoulders, drooping her posture to look smaller, weaker. She let out a wet, hacking cough that shook her entire frame, burying her face in her elbow to hide her features. "I am sorry, Ma-am," Ebony rasped. Her voice dropped an octave, scratching and rough like sandpaper. "I have the flu. The agency said I could work if I stayed away from the guests. I am just looking for the trash." Victoria recoiled as if Ebony were radioactive. She covered her nose and mouth with her hand, stepping back toward the poisoned drinks, protecting them from the germs. "Oh, you are disgusting," Victoria sneered, her suspicion replaced by pure revulsion. "Do not breathe on me or the food. Get out of here before you infect the children. Go." Ebony nodded, keeping her head bowed, and backed out of the room, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had the footage, but the poisoned drinks were still on the counter, and Victoria was preparing to serve them. Victoria watched the swinging doors settle into stillness, but the knot of anxiety in her stomach did not loosen. She had dismissed the server as a sick, incompetent fool, but her survival instinct, honed by years of manipulation and deceit, was screaming at her. She looked at the tray of juice glasses now sitting on the side table ready for the children. The pink powder had dissolved completely, leaving no trace, but the nagging feeling that she had been watched would not go away. She turned her head slightly, catching the eye of the massive man standing in the shadows of the archway. This was not one of the regular estate security team. This was Brutus, her personal insurance policy, a man she paid off the books to handle problems that required silence. "Follow her," Victoria whispered without moving her lips. Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen doors. "Do not let her leave the building. If she goes anywhere other than the service exit, you take her to the basement, and Brutus check her pockets." I think she stole something? Brutus nodded once, a subtle dip of his chin, and slipped into the crowd, moving with the terrifying grace of a predator tracking a wounded animal. On the main stage, the spotlight was blinding. Julian shielded his eyes, scanning the sea of darkness beyond the glare. He was running out of words. He had thanked the donors. He had thanked the board. He had even told a wandering anecdote about the estate's history, but there was still no signal from Marcus or Ebony. The teleprompter had run out of text 5 minutes ago. He was improvising now, stalling for time while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. And then he saw it. In the front row, the nannies were ushering the triplets toward the stage. The children looked small and fragile in their formal wear, moving with a robotic stiffness that broke his heart. Victoria was gliding toward them, holding the silver tray with the 3 crystal glasses. The poison was in transit. "I would like to take a moment," Julian said, his voice booming through the speakers, a little too loud, a little too desperate, to talk about the future, because that is what we are here for, right? The future of medicine, the future of our children. He saw Victoria pause, glancing up at him with a confused frown. She tapped her wrist, signaling him to wrap it up. He ignored her. He looked toward the back of the room, praying for a miracle, praying that Ebony had made it to the control room. Ebony was sprinting down the service corridor, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the linoleum. She knew the layout of the house better than the architect who built it. She bypassed the kitchen exit and took a sharp left toward the narrow staircase that led to the mezzanine. This was where the audiovisual technicians controlled the lights, the sound, and the massive LED screen behind the stage. If she could get inside, she could hijack the feed. She reached the heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling with adrenaline. She was 3 seconds away from exposing the truth, 3 seconds away from saving Noah, Lucas, and Ava. A hand the size of a dinner plate slammed onto the door just above her head, blocking her path. Ebony gasped, spinning around. She found herself staring into the chest of the man Victoria called Brutus. He looked down at her, his eyes cold and empty, devoid of any mercy. He did not ask her what she was doing. He did not ask for her ID. He reached out and grabbed the front of her catering vest, bunching the fabric in his fist. He lifted her off her feet, slamming her back against the concrete wall so hard her vision blurred. "Going the wrong way." "Little mouse," Brutus growled, his other hand reaching up to rip the mask from her face. "I think the trash exit is downstairs. Let's go for a walk." The concrete wall felt cold against her spine, as Brutus tightened his grip, crushing the fabric of the catering vest against her throat. His other hand ripped the mask from her face, exposing her identity to the harsh fluorescent lights of the service corridor. He smiled, a cruel twisting of lips that promised pain, but Ebony did not freeze. She had anticipated this moment. She knew she could not overpower a man twice her size, but she could outsmart him. She reached into her waistband, not for a weapon, but for a small plastic spray bottle filled with concentrated chili oil extract she had mixed in the safe-house kitchen. As Brutus leaned in to sneer at her, she thrust the bottle upward and squeezed the trigger. A mist of burning red liquid hit him directly in the eyes. Brutus roared in pain, releasing her instantly to claw at his burning face. He staggered back, crashing into a stack of metal folding chairs, sending them clattering to the floor in a deafening cacophony. Ebony dropped to her knees, gasping for air, her lungs burning. But the impact of her fall dislodged the button camera from her vest. The tiny device, the only thing that held the proof of Victoria's guilt, skittered across the polished linoleum, spinning away from her like a coin. It stopped 10 feet away near the edge of the stairwell. That was the evidence. That was the confession. That was Noah's life, sitting on the precipice of the dark descent. Ebony scrambled on her hands and knees, lunging for it. Brutus was blind, but he was not deaf. He heard her movement. He lashed out blindly, his massive hand closing around Ebony's ankle, just as her fingers brushed the black plastic casing of the camera. He yanked her back with terrifying strength. She screamed, her fingernails scraping against the floor tiles, trying to hold her ground. He was dragging her back toward him, ready to crush her. She kicked at his face, her boot connecting with his jaw, but his grip was like steel. She was going to lose. She was going to die in this hallway, and the truth would die with her. Then a shadow fell over them. A boot slammed into the side of Brutus's head with the force of a sledgehammer. The grip on her ankle vanished instantly. Marcus stood there breathing hard. His fists clenched his face, a mask of calculated violence. Brutus lay unconscious on the floor, a heap of muscle and malice silenced by the head of security, who had finally chosen a side. Marcus reached down and pulled Ebony to her feet, shoving the camera back into her hand. His eyes were wide with urgency. "Go!" he shouted, pointing toward the heavy metal door of the control room at the end of the hall. "Get inside and lock the door. I will hold them off. Do not stop until everyone sees what is on that drive. Go now." Ebony did not waste a second. She gripped the camera tight, feeling the plastic bite into her palm, and sprinted toward the door, leaving Marcus standing guard over the fallen giant. She had the weapon. Now she just had to pull the trigger. The spotlight blinded him, but Julian could hear the applause washing over the stage like a tide of fake adoration. He looked down at his children. Noah, Lucas, and Ava were standing there in their tiny tuxedos and velvet dresses. They looked beautiful. They looked perfect. They looked dead. Their eyes were glazed over, staring at nothing. They swayed slightly on their feet like puppets with cut strings, barely able to hold their own weight. Victoria glided toward them, a vision in emerald silk holding the silver tray. The crystal glasses sparkled under the stage lights, filled with the amber liquid that would erase their minds. "Drink up, my darlings," she whispered. Her voice amplified by the lapel mic she wore for the cameras. Just a little sip for energy. She held the glass to Noah's lips. The boy opened his mouth instinctively, trained to obey the woman who terrified him. Julian felt his heart slam against his ribs. He scanned the darkness above the crowd, searching the mezzanine, searching the control booth window. Where was she? Where was Ebony? If she was not there, if Marcus had failed, then his son was about to swallow poison in front of 500 witnesses, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without destroying everything. Then he saw it, a single flicker of light from the tech booth high above the crowd, a silhouette pressed against the glass giving a sharp thumbs up. It was Ebony. She was in. She had the feed. Victoria tilted the glass. The liquid touched Noah's lip. "Wait!" Julian shouted. His voice boomed through the sound system, causing a screech of feedback that made the audience wince. He snatched the microphone from the stand, his movement so sudden and violent that Victoria flinched, nearly dropping the tray, liquid sloshing over the rim onto her expensive dress. The room went silent. The music cut out instantly. 500 pairs of eyes locked onto the billionaire standing center stage. He looked at Victoria, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and fury masked by a frozen smile. He looked at his children, who were too drugged to even register the commotion. Noah blinked slowly, the glass still hovering inches from his mouth. "I know we are all here to celebrate the future," Julian said, his voice trembling with a rage he could barely contain. "I know we are here to raise glasses and write checks, but before we drink, before we celebrate the charity of this family, I think it is important we understand exactly what we are supporting." He turned to look directly into the main camera lens, broadcasting live to the donors and the press. He saw the red light blinking. He knew the world was watching. "I have prepared a special presentation. A tribute, really. Before we toast, I want everyone in this room to watch a short film about the reality of motherhood." He pointed a shaking finger to the massive LED screen descending behind them. Victoria took a step back, her eyes darting to the screen, sensing the trap, but unable to stop it. Julian gripped the mic until his hand hurt. "Watch closely," he whispered into the silence. "Watch very closely." The massive LED screen behind the stage did not play a symphony of strings or show slow motion. Clips of children running through meadows. It flickered once, a burst of static that made the crowd murmur and then stabilized into a high-definition nightmare. The image was shaky, angled upward from chest height. It was raw, unedited footage. The timestamp in the corner read 20 minutes ago. The room saw the stainless steel of the prep kitchen. They saw the back of a woman in an emerald green dress. There was no mistaking who it was. Victoria St. James turned profile to the hidden lens, a smirk twisting her red lips that looked nothing like the benevolent smile she wore for the photographers. In her hand, she held a glass vial filled with a glowing pink powder. She was not preparing a toast. She was preparing a weapon. The audio crackled through the ballroom speakers, loud and undeniable. Victoria's voice, sharp and dismissive, echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Relax," she said into her phone, pressing it between her shoulder and ear as she uncorked the vial. "I am handling it. After this dose, they will be catatonic for a week." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. 500 people froze their champagne glasses halfway to their mouths. On the screen, Victoria tipped the powder into the crystal flutes. It hissed as it dissolved. "My father will be thrilled with the test data." She continued, her voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "The side effects are brutal, but the sedation lasts longer than the last batch. Tell him to get the wire transfer ready. I will finally have the cash to clear the debt. And once I get that ring on my finger, I will ship these brats to a boarding school in Switzerland, and we will never have to look at them again." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a room full of people realizing they had been applauding a monster. Every eye turned from the black screen to the woman standing center stage. Victoria stood frozen, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax figure melting under the heat of the lights. The emerald dress that had looked so regal moments ago now looked like a costume, a disguise that had just been ripped away. On the stage, little Ava stood next to her brothers. She was holding the crystal flute, the amber liquid swirling innocently inside. She looked up at the giant screen, then at the woman who had terrorized her for months. Her small hand began to tremble. The glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the stage floor with a sound that seemed louder than a bomb. The crystal shattered, sending shards flying. The poisoned juice splashed across Victoria's shoes, staining the silk hem of her dress like acid. The sound broke the spell. The room erupted. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps and murmurs that sounded like a physical wave crashing against the stage. Victoria stood center stage, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. The color had drained so completely from her face that her makeup stood out like war paint on a corpse. For a heartbeat, she was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her exposure. The video loop on the screen behind her played again, her own voice sneering about shipping the children to Switzerland. Then the paralysis broke. It was replaced by a feral, animalistic panic. Victoria lunged toward the side of the stage, her heels skidding on the wet floor where the poison juice had spilled. She was not running away. She was running toward the control panel. She clawed at the air, screaming at the tech booth to cut the feed. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice shredding her throat. "Turn it off right now!" She reached for the master power cable snaking up the side of the podium, desperate to plunge the room into darkness to hide her sin. But a hand clamped around her wrist. It was not a gentle touch. It was a vice of iron. Julian jerked her back from the cables, his grip bruising. He spun her around, forcing her to face him and the 500 witnesses she had tried to deceive. He ripped the microphone from her hand before she could scream another order. "You are done," Julian said, his voice low and trembling with a mixture of hatred and grief. He looked at the woman he was going to marry and saw only a stranger. "You are a demon." The words were amplified by the sound system booming over the crowd. Victoria flinched as if he had struck her. She looked at the crowd searching for an ally, searching for someone, anyone who would believe her mask over the reality on the screen. But all she saw were lenses. The press pit had turned into a firing squad. The flashbulbs exploded in a blinding, stroboscopic storm. Click, click, click. Every frame captured her terror, her ruined dress, the madness in her eyes. They were documenting her destruction in real time. Victoria covered her face with her hands, but the cameras did not stop. She lowered her hands, her expression twisting from fear to a manic, desperate rage. She pointed a shaking finger toward the shadows of the mezzanine where Ebony had signaled from. "It is a lie," Victoria screamed, her voice cracking. "It is fake. That video is a deep fake. The maid did it. She is a hacker. She wants to ruin me. Can you not see? She staged the whole thing." She looked wild, her hair coming loose from its pins, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. She grabbed the lapels of a senator standing near the stage, pleading with him. "Tell them it is not real. Tell them I love those children." The senator stepped back, recoiling from her touch, as if she were contagious. Victoria stood alone in the spotlight, screaming lies that no one believed while the video of her crime played on a loop behind her, a towering digital monument to her cruelty. The screams of denial died in Victoria's throat, as a movement caught the attention of the front row. From the shadows of the side stage curtain, a figure emerged. It was the server, the one Victoria had dismissed as sick and filthy. But she was not holding a tray anymore. She reached up with trembling hands and pulled the coarse black wig from her head, letting it fall to the floor. Then she ripped the N95 mask away. The bright stage lights hit her face, revealing the truth. It was Ebony Davis, but she did not look like a villain. She looked like a survivor of a war zone. Her hair was matted with sweat. A dark bruise was blooming across her jawline and a cut on her forehead. From the struggle with Brutus was trickling fresh blood down her temple, staining her skin. She stood tall in the cheap catering vest, her chest heaving with exertion. A hush fell over the room that was heavier than the applause had been. Ebony did not look at the cameras flashing in her face. She did not look at Julian, who was standing there with his heart in his throat. She did not even look at Victoria, who was shrinking back in horror as if seeing a ghost. Ebony only had eyes for 3 people. She walked across the stage, her sneakers squeaking on the wet floor where the poisoned glass had shattered. She stopped 5 feet away from the children. She did not speak. She did not need to. She just dropped to her knees, opening her arms wide. Noah, Lucas, and Ava had been standing like statues, frozen in a chemical fog of fear and confusion. But the moment they saw her face, the moment they recognized the woman kneeling before them, the spell broke. It was a visceral reaction. A collective sob tore from their small throats. "Ebony," they screamed in unison, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. They did not run to their father. They certainly did not run to Victoria. They sprinted toward the maid. They collided with her, burying their faces in her neck, clinging to her vest, gripping her arms as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand. Ebony wrapped her arms around all 3 of them, pulling them tight against her chest, rocking them back and forth, ignoring the pain in her ribs. The room watched in stunned silence. There was no deep fake here. There was no manipulation. Children do not run to a monster. They run to safety. They run to love. The image of the triplets clinging to the bleeding woman while recoiling from the woman in the emerald gown was the most damning evidence of the night. It was a verdict rendered without a jury. Victoria stood alone on the other side of the stage, watching her narrative crumble into dust. She realized then that she had lost not because of a video, but because she had underestimated the one thing she could never fake: the bond between a caregiver and the children she would die to protect. The crash of the double doors opening was the final note in the symphony of Victoria's destruction. It was not the applause she had craved. It was the heavy thud of tactical boots hitting the parquet floor. A team of officers swept into the ballroom, moving with the precise aggression of a raid. They did not stop for the senators or the socialites. They parted the sea of tuxedos and gowns, marching straight toward the stage. Julian stepped down from the platform, meeting the lead detective halfway. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He did not hand it over tentatively. He slammed it into the detective's chest. "This is the toxicology report from the sample I processed this morning," Julian said, his voice projecting to the back of the silent room. "It confirms high concentrations of NeuroX in the vomit of my 4-year-old son. A drug that St. James Pharmaceuticals has been failing to get approved for 5 years. And these are the sworn affidavits from the private lending firms in Las Vegas confirming that Victoria St. James and her father owe $15 million in gambling debts. Debts they promised to pay with the proceeds from the patent sale of that drug." The detective opened the file, scanning the chemical breakdown and the financial records. He looked up, his eyes hard. "This is enough for probable cause." Victoria stood frozen on the stage, watching the legal noose tighten. She looked for an escape route, but there was none. She looked for an ally, but the crowd had recoiled from her as if she were radioactive. She looked for her father. Franklin St. James, the CEO of the pharmaceutical empire, was trying to blend into the crowd of stunned donors near the exit. He was inching toward the service door, sweating through his expensive suit. He thought he could slip away. He thought his money and his connections would shield him from the fallout of his daughter's mess. He was wrong. 2 officers intercepted him before he could reach the handle. Franklin shouted indignantly, trying to pull rank. "Do you know who I am? I am a donor to the police fund. Get your hands off me." Julian pointed a shaking finger at the old man. "Arrest him too. He is the architect. He provided the compound. He pressured her to increase the dosage because his clinical trials were failing. He sanctioned the poisoning of my children to save his stock price." The officers did not hesitate. They spun the struggling CEO around and slammed him against the wall, cuffing his hands behind his back. The sight of her powerful father being manhandled like a common criminal broke the last of Victoria's resolve. Her knees buckled. The empire was not just cracking, it was turning into dust. She watched as they read him his rights, the words echoing in the vast hall like a funeral dirge for the St. James legacy. The money was gone. The influence was gone. And the handcuffs were coming for her next. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Victoria's wrists with a finality that shattered whatever delusion of control she had left. The sound of the ratcheting metal was louder than the camera shutters, louder than the gasps of the socialites who were now holding up their phones to record her downfall. The detective did not be gentle. He twisted her arms behind her back, forcing her to bow forward in a posture of submission that she had spent her entire life avoiding. Victoria screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She thrashed against the officer holding her, kicking out with her heels, tearing the expensive silk of her emerald gown. She looked like a wild animal caught in a trap, biting and snarling at the iron bars. The mask of the perfect stepmother, the grieving fiancé, the charitable saint had not just slipped, it had been incinerated. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, spitting saliva onto the lapel of the detective's suit. "Do you know who I am? Amma St. James. My family built this city. You cannot touch me. You are nothing. You are all nothing." She whipped her head around, her hair wild and tangled across her face, glaring at the crowd of people she had charmed just an hour ago. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and manic. She did not see people anymore. She saw enemies. She saw insects. "Stop filming me!" she roared, lunging toward a reporter in the front row. The officer jerked her back, and she stumbled, nearly falling onto the wet stage where the poisoned juice lay in a sticky puddle. "It is all a lie. That maid set me up. She is a criminal. She is jealous of me. Look at her." She pointed her chin toward Ebony, who was still kneeling on the floor, shielding the 3 terrified children with her body. Ebony did not look up. She just held Noah, Lucas, and Ava tighter, pressing their ears against her chest so they would not hear the venom spilling from the woman who was supposed to be their mother. Victoria laughed, a high-pitched broken sound that made the hair on Julian's arms stand up. "You think she is a hero?" Victoria sneered, looking at Ebony. "She is a rat. A dirty little rat who crawled out of the gutter to steal my life. I should have killed you when I had the chance. I should have doubled the dose and finished the job." The confession hung in the air, breathless and terrible. She had stopped pretending. She had admitted it openly. The crowd recoiled, a collective wave of revulsion passing through the room. The detective tightened his grip, propelling her toward the stairs to lead her away. The show was over. The villain was caught, but Victoria was not done. She was going to prison. She knew that now. The money was gone. Her father was in chains. Her reputation was ashes. But she still had one weapon left, one jagged shard of glass she could use to stab the man who had exposed her. She dug her heels into the carpet, refusing to move, forcing the officers to drag her. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice changing pitch, dropping from a scream to a poisonous hiss. She locked eyes with Julian. He was standing near the edge of the stage, looking at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. He looked like a man who had survived a war, battered but standing tall with his children safe behind him. Victoria hated that look. She hated his relief. She hated that he thought he had won. She stopped fighting the officers. She stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, her eyes boring into his. "You think you are so smart, Julian," she said, her voice carrying over the silence of the room. "You think you figured it all out. You think you saved your precious legacy?" Julian did not answer. He just stared at her, waiting for them to take her away. "Go ahead, play the hero." She spat a cruel smile, twisting her lips. "But before you celebrate your happy ending, you might want to ask yourself one question. Julian, you are a man of science, right? You like facts. You like data." The officers pulled her arm, urging her to move. "Come on, let's go," the detective grunted. Victoria planted her feet, leaning forward as far as the cuffs would allow. Her eyes were black holes of malice. "Why did the medicine work so differently on them?" she whispered loud enough for him to hear. "Why did their blood types not match the donor records in the hospital?" Julian frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" Victoria threw her head back and laughed, a sound that was devoid of any humor. "You really are a fool, Julian. You spent all this time protecting them, fighting for them, crying over them, but you never stopped to check the basics, did you?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall. "You think they are your children?" she hissed, exposing her teeth in a wolfish grin. "You think those three brats share your DNA? You arrogant idiot! Look at them! Look at them closely!" Julian froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked past her to the huddle of children on the floor. Noah with his dark curls, Lucas with his pale skin, Ava with her wide eyes. He had never questioned it. They were his. They had to be. Victoria saw the doubt bloom in his eyes and she seized it, twisting the knife. "Check the paternity test, Julian," she screamed as the officers finally dragged her down the stairs, kicking and laughing. "Check the real records. Your dead wife was a liar too. You are not their father. You are just the bank, and you have been saving another man's children." Her laughter trailed behind her, echoing down the hallway as the police hauled her out of the double doors, leaving a silence in her wake that was heavier and more suffocating than the storm outside. The crowd stared at Julian. The cameras were still rolling, capturing the color, draining from his face, capturing the moment the victory turned into ashes in his mouth. He looked at the children he loved more than life itself, and for the first time in 4 years, a crack formed in the foundation of his world. The monster was gone, but her final curse remained poisoning the air long after she had left. The last police cruiser pulled away from the curb, its red and blue lights fading into the Chicago night, leaving the estate in a sudden deafening silence. The ballroom, which had been a hive of chaos just an hour ago, was now a graveyard of abandoned champagne glasses and overturned chairs. The catering staff moved silently in the background, sweeping up the shards of the broken crystal flute that had held the poison. But the main floor was empty, save for 3 people and 3 sleeping children. Julian sat on the edge of the stage, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie undone. He looked exhausted, a man who had run a marathon through a minefield. He was staring at the spot where Victoria had stood, where she had delivered her final poisonous barb, before being dragged away into the dark. Her words still hung in the air, like a toxic mist, poisoning the relief of the victory. "You are not their father." Ebony walked toward him, carrying a blanket she had found in the emergency kit. She moved softly, her sneakers making no sound on the plush carpet. She draped the blanket over the triplets who were curled up together on a velvet love seat, fast asleep. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving them comatose with fatigue but safe. Ebony lingered by them for a moment, brushing a curl of hair off Noah's forehead, before turning to face the man who had just saved them. She walked to the stage and sat down next to him, keeping a respectful distance. She did not know what to say. How do you comfort a man who has just been told in front of the world that his family is a lie? She decided to say nothing. She just sat there, offering him her presence, her silence as a form of support. Julian stared at his hands resting on his knees. They were shaking slightly, escaping the adrenaline dump. "Ebony," he said, his voice rough and quiet. "She thought that would kill me. She thought that was the final bullet to the heart." Ebony looked at him, her eyes full of sorrow. "It does not matter, Julian." What she said was cruel. It was the lashing out of a cornered animal. "You do not have to listen to it." Julian turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were surprisingly clear. There was no devastation in them, only a deep, weary sadness, combined with a strange resolve. "I know what she meant, Ebony," Julian said steadily. "I did not need a paternity test to know the results. I have known for 6 years." Ebony froze her breath, catching in her throat. "You knew." Julian nodded, looking back at the sleeping children. "I am sterile, Ebony. It was a complication from an illness in my 20s. I knew I could never have biological children. My late wife. She wanted a family more than anything. We tried everything. When the doctors told us it was impossible. With my genetics, we made a choice. We used a donor. We used IVF. It was a clinical process, sterile and scientific." He paused, looking at the shattered remains of the glass on the floor. Victoria found the medical records. She must have dug them up when she was raiding the safe for money. "She thought she held a secret that would destroy me. She thought that if she revealed they were not my blood, that I would abandon them, that I would see them as broken merchandise, just like she did." He stood up and walked over to the love seat. He knelt beside the children, his hand resting on Lucas's back, feeling the rise and fall of the boy's breathing. "But she does not understand." Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She thinks fatherhood is biology. She thinks it is a strand of DNA, or a resemblance in the nose or the eyes. She is wrong. I was there when they were born. Ebony. I cut the cords. I held them when they screamed. I walked the floors with them. At 3 in the morning, when they had fevers, I taught Noah how to tie his shoes. I held Ava when she scraped her knee." He looked up at Ebony, and tears were finally spilling down his cheeks. Not tears of shame, but tears of absolute clarity. "I am not their biological father, I know that. But I am their dad. I chose them every single day. I choose them. And that bond is stronger than any blood Victoria could ever understand." She thought she was exposing a lie, but she was just revealing the truth of how much I love them. I do not love them because they are mine. I love them because they are them. Ebony listened to him, and she felt something shift inside her chest. She had respected Julian as a powerful man. She had admired him as a fighter, but now looking at him kneeling on the floor in his ruined tuxedo, confessing his vulnerability, she saw something else. She saw a kind of nobility that was rare in the world. She had spent her life believing that family was about blood, about the debts you owed to the people who shared your name. Her own father had used that blood connection to drag her down, to ruin her medical career, to almost get her killed. But here was a man with no biological tie to these children, willing to burn down his entire life to keep them safe. Ebony stood up and walked over to him. She placed a hand on his, shoulder squeezing gently. It was the first time she had touched him without fear, without the barrier of employer and employee. She was wrong. Ebony said, her voice firm and warm. She lost, Julian. She lost because she underestimated you, and she underestimated what makes a family. You are the only father they have ever known, and you are the only one they will ever need. Julian covered her hand with his own, gripping it tight. He looked at the woman who had faced down a killer for children that were not hers either. We make a good team, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. Ebony looked at the children, then back at him. Yes, we do, she answered. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in the room was not empty. It was full of promise. It was the sound of a new foundation being poured, one built not on blood or money, but on the solid, unbreakable rock of choice. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving the city of Chicago under a blanket of white that looked clean rather than dangerous. Inside the Thorne estate, the air had changed. The tension that had vibrated through the hallways for months was gone, replaced by a quiet warmth that felt almost unfamiliar. Ebony moved through the nursery with the soft tread of a guardian angel. She adjusted the humidifier, ensuring the air was perfect for Noah's lungs. She tucked the duvet around Lucas, checking his temperature with the back of her hand out of habit. She smoothed the hair back from Ava's forehead, watching the little girl sleep without the twitching nightmare symptoms of the drug. For the first time in forever, they were just children, sleeping in safety, not subjects in a cruel experiment. Julian stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching her. He had changed out of his ruined tuxedo into a simple cashmere sweater and jeans. He looked younger, less like the titan of industry who commanded boardrooms, and more like the man who had sat on the floor and confessed his secrets. He watched the way Ebony cared for them, the way she anticipated their needs before they even woke. It was not the service of a maid, it was the instinct of a mother. Ebony turned and saw him. She straightened her uniform, smoothing the wrinkles nervously. "Is everything okay, sir?" she whispered, moving toward the door so they would not wake the children. "I can go down to the kitchen and start the cleanup. The staff is overwhelmed." Julian shook his head, stepping forward to block her path. "You are not going to the kitchen, Ebony. You are never cleaning a floor in this house again." Ebony blinked, confused. "But I work for you. I need the job, Julian. I have nowhere else to go." "I know," Julian said, his voice low and serious. "But you are overqualified to be a maid. You are a medical student. You are a detective. And tonight, you were a soldier." He took a breath, searching for the right words. "I am firing you, Ebony." Ebony felt her heart drop, panic rising in her throat. "What, I am firing you as the maid?" Julian corrected, a small smile touching his eyes. "I want to hire you as the estate manager. I want you to run this house, Ebony. I want you to manage the staff, the budget, the schedules. But more than that, I want you to be the legal guardian of my children when I am away on business." Ebony stared at him, unable to process the words. Legal guardian. That was not a job title. It was a position of absolute trust. It meant he was putting their lives in her hands legally and publicly. "You trust me with that?" she asked, her voice trembling after everything. Julian looked past her at the sleeping triplets, then back into her eyes with an intensity that burned. "I trust you with their lives because you are the only one who fought for them when I was blind. You are not just staff, Ebony. You are the reason they are alive. I want you here, not in the servants' quarters, but in the guest suite. I want you to help me raise them. Will you stay?" Ebony looked around the room at the peace she had fought so hard to win. She looked at the man who was offering her dignity instead of charity. She nodded, slowly, tears pricking her eyes. "I will stay," she whispered. "I will stay." The ice that had choked Chicago 6 months ago had finally melted, giving way to a vibrant, hopeful spring. The trees in the park were heavy with blossoms, and the wind that blew off the lake was no longer a knife, but a gentle caress. Julian stood on the balcony of the penthouse, watching the city below. He had signed the final papers yesterday. Thorne Biotech was no more. He had sold the company, stripping his name from the glass monolith that had housed so many secrets and pain. In its place, he had launched the Thorne Community Health Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to pediatric care and transparent ethical drug research. He was no longer chasing profit. He was chasing redemption, and for the first time in years, he slept without nightmares. The television in the background murmured the news, but it was just white noise now. The anchor spoke of the sentencing that had captivated the nation. Victoria St. James the Fallen. Socialite had been given 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The jury had not been swayed by her tears or her lawyer's attempts to plead insanity. The evidence was too overwhelming. The video of her poisoning the juice, the financial records linking her to the debt, and the testimony of her own father, who had turned on her to save himself, had sealed her fate. The image on the screen showed a woman in an orange jumpsuit, stripped of her diamonds and her dignity, walking into a concrete cell. The door slammed shut, and Julian simply picked up the remote and turned it off. She was a ghost story now, a shadow that had been banished by the light. The front door opened and chaos poured in. But it was the good kind of chaos. Noah, Lucas, and Ava tumbled into the hallway, their laughter echoing off the walls. They were healthy, their cheeks pink, their eyes bright and clear. The lethargy and fear were gone, replaced by the boundless energy of childhood. But the person following them was the one who made Julian smile. The widest Ebony walked in, carrying a stack of heavy textbooks, her face glowing with a pride he had never seen before. She set the books down on the table. Anatomy, physiology, pathology. She was no longer the maid, scrubbing floors. She was a student at Northwestern again, re-enrolled with a full scholarship provided by the Thorne Foundation. Julian walked over to her, watching her interact with the children who adored her. She looked tired, but it was a good tired. The exhaustion of someone chasing a dream. "How was class?" Julian asked, leaning against the counter. Ebony looked up, her eyes shining. "It was hard," she admitted, breathing out a laugh. "The workload is insane and I have 3 exams next week. But it was wonderful. I got my white coat today." Julian nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He remembered the day he found her freezing in the bus stop, believing her life was over. Now she stood in the center of his home, the future stretching out before her like a golden road. "You earned it," Julian said softly. "You earned every thread of it, Dr. Davis." Ebony smiled, and for a moment the memory of the freezing snow and the poisoned gala felt like a lifetime ago. She picked up Noah, who was tugging at her sleeve, and spun him around, listening to his delighted squeal. The winter was over, the cold was gone, and the sun had finally come out to stay. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees of Lincoln Park, casting dappled shadows across the grass. It was a stark contrast to the biting wind and gray ice that had defined their lives just 6 months ago. Julian sat on a weathered wooden bench, his elbows resting on his knees, watching the triplets chase a bright red frisbee in the distance. They were screaming with laughter, a sound that used to be absent from his world. Now it was the soundtrack of his life. Ebony sat beside him, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. She was not wearing a uniform. She was wearing jeans and a soft cream-colored sweater that caught the light. She looked tired, her eyes showing the strain of late-night study sessions for her anatomy finals. But she looked happy. She looked free. "You are staring at them again," Ebony said softly, taking a sip of her coffee. "You look like you expect them to disappear if you blink." Julian smiled, but he did not look away. "Old habits die hard, I suppose. For so long I watched them for symptoms. Now I just watch them be children. It is a luxury I never thought I would have." He turned his head to look at her. The distance between them on the bench was small, but the chasm of class and status that used to separate them had vanished completely. They were just two people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side. "I got my midterms back today," Ebony said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I aced pathology." "I never doubted you for a second," Julian replied. And he meant it. He shifted his body, turning to face her fully. "Ebony, there is something I have been wanting to say, something that isn't about the tuition or the estate management or the legal guardianship." Ebony set her coffee down, feeling the shift in the air. She looked at him, waiting. "When I asked you to stay," Julian began, his voice low and steady, "I told you it was because the children needed you, and that was true. They adore you. You are the mother they never had. But I realized something these past few weeks when you were at the library until midnight." He looked down at his hands, then back up into her eyes, exposing a vulnerability he usually kept hidden behind his wealth and his stoicism. "The house is too quiet when you are not there, and it is not just the children who miss you. I miss you. I miss our talks. I miss the way you challenge me. I miss having a partner who knows the worst parts of my life and stayed anyway." Ebony felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee or the sun. She had spent so long surviving, so long fighting to prove she was worthy of space, that hearing this man say he needed her felt like the final exhale after a marathon. "You are not my boss anymore," Julian, Ebony whispered. "No," Julian said, reaching out to cover her hand with his. His grip was warm, firm, and sure. "I am not. I am just a man who is incredibly grateful that you walked into his life. And I am hoping that maybe in between medical school and saving the world, you might have some time for me. Not for the father of the triplets, but just for Julian." Ebony looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, seeing the kindness and the strength there. She saw the man who had walked into the snow to find her. She saw the man who had destroyed his own reputation to save his family. And for the first time, she allowed herself to see a future that was not just about survival, but about happiness. "I think I can make time for Julian," she said, a soft smile curving her lips. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. "I think I would like that very much." In the distance, Noah, Lucas, and Ava cheered as the frisbee flew high into the air. But on the bench, the world had narrowed down to two people sitting in the sunlight, beginning a new chapter. Not as savior and victim, not as master and servant, but as partners facing the future together. The smell of roasted rosemary chicken filled the kitchen, a scent that was grounded and real completely, unlike the sterile, catered meals that used to appear on the long mahogany dining table. Ebony stood at the counter, mashing potatoes with a vigor that made her laugh. The triplets were underfoot, tasked with setting the table, a job they took with absolute seriousness. Lucas was carefully placing the napkins while Ava arranged the forks. Noah, however, was hovering by Ebony's elbow, his eyes fixed on the steaming pot. "Mom," he said, tugging on the hem of her sweater, "can I have the drumstick, please?" The word hung in the air, suspended in the steam and the warmth of the room. "Mom." He had not said it with hesitation. He had not whispered it like a question. He had said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if it were her name. Ebony froze, the masher still in her hand. Her heart gave a singular, painful thump against her ribs, before expanding with a warmth that flooded her entire body. She looked down at the little boy with the dark curls, who looked back at her with innocent hunger, not realizing he had just rewritten her entire identity. She turned slowly to look at Julian. He was leaning against the island doorway holding a bottle of wine. He had heard it. He was smiling, a soft, knowing smile that reached his eyes. He did not correct the boy. He simply raised his glass in a silent toast, acknowledging the title she had earned 1,000 times over. "You can have the drumstick, Noah." Ebony whispered, her voice thick with emotion, asking her vocal cords to work through the lump in her throat. "Go sit down, baby." As the children scrambled onto their chairs, Julian walked over to her. He placed the wine bottle on the counter and reached into his pocket, pulling out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the marble surface toward her. "I was going to wait until your graduation," Julian said softly, "but today feels like the right day. Open it." Ebony wiped her hands on a towel and picked up the envelope. It felt heavy. She broke the seal and pulled out a stack of legal documents, clips to a set of silver keys. On top was a photograph. It was a picture of a small brick house on the south side. The porch was freshly painted white, the windows were new, and the eviction notice that had once been plastered to the door was gone, replaced by a wreath of spring flowers. "It is your grandmother's house," Julian said, watching her face intently. "I tracked down the holding company that bought it after the foreclosure. I bought it back. It is fully renovated. It is yours, Ebony. The deed is in your name. You will never have to worry about losing your history again." Ebony looked from the photo to the man standing before her. The man who had not only given her a future but restored her past. She thought about the cold night she was thrown out into the snow, the night she lost everything, and now she held the keys to her home in one hand and the heart of this family in the other. The tears came then, hot and fast, spilling over her cheeks. Ebony did not try to stop them. She let out a laugh that sounded like a sob and threw her arms around Julian, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight, kissing the top of her head while the children cheered from the table, thinking this was just a game of hugs. They did not eat in the formal dining room that night. They ate in the kitchen, huddled around the breakfast nook, elbows touching passing bowls of food, family style. The mansion was vast and expensive, but the only thing that mattered was contained within those four walls. The sound of cutlery clinking against plates, the sound of Noah telling a story about a frog he found, and the sound of Julian laughing freely, without the weight of the world on his shoulders as the scene drifted into the evening. The lights of the kitchen glowed like a beacon against the dark. A testament that even in the coldest winter, kindness can bloom, that trust can be rebuilt, and that sometimes the family you choose is the strongest bloodline of all. The darkness faded, leaving only the warmth of a home that was finally truly whole. The most profound lesson we can take from the story of the Thorne estate is that true nobility has nothing to do with bloodlines or bank accounts, but is defined entirely by the choices we make when we think no one is watching. Victoria St. James possessed every advantage the world could offer. She had the pedigree, the wealth, the beauty, and the social standing, yet beneath that polished exterior lay a moral vacuum. She viewed human beings as commodities and children as leverage, proving that a person can be draped in silk and diamonds, but still be spiritually destitute. Her downfall serves as a grim reminder that lies, no matter how expensive or well constructed, are like castles built on sand. They may stand for a season, but they will inevitably crumble when the tide of truth comes in. In stark contrast, we have Ebony Davis, a woman who was stripped of her career, her home, and her identity. Yet she never lost her compass. She teaches us that integrity is not a suit you wear when it is convenient. It is armor you forge in the fire of adversity. When she was freezing in the snow, hunted and alone, she could have chosen self-preservation. She could have run, but she chose to return to the lion's den for 3 children who were not hers. This redefines our understanding of family. The story beautifully illustrates that family is not solely defined by DNA or a birth certificate. it is defined by devotion. Julian discovered that his lack of biological connection to the triplets did not diminish his love. It purified it. He chose to be their father every single day, not out of obligation to genetics, but out of a fierce commitment to their well-being ultimately. This narrative reminds us that while evil may be loud and aggressive, kindness is persistent and enduring. The truth is like a seed buried under the snow. You can try to freeze it or hide it under layers of deception, but eventually the season will turn and it will bloom. The heroes of this story were not the ones with the loudest voices, but the ones with the quietest strength, proving that love born from sacrifice is the most powerful force on earth. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that family is a choice we make with love rather than blood, please share this with someone you consider your chosen family, and do not forget to follow our channel for more stories that explore the incredible depths of the human spirit.